In July 2019, an environmental research team disappeared during an expedition deep in the western Amazon. When rescuers arrived, they found only a single member, dehydrated, exhausted, and alone. He was the last person to see the others alive. This is his account. I'd seen jungle before, but nothing like this. We'd been traveling for almost 3 days upriver, the outboard motor coughing through tangles of floating debris. The banks rose in steep walls of green, so dense the daylight barely touched the water. Every few miles, we passed the wrecks of old boats, metal hulls rusted to skeletons, half swallowed by vines. Our guide, a man named Leandro, didn't speak much English. He mostly pointed, grunted, or shook his head when we asked questions. He'd been reluctant to take us this far. Every time he checked the old hand-drawn map, he'd mutter something under his breath that none of us could translate. Grayson, our expedition lead, called it superstition. I wasn't so sure. By the time we reached the inlet, the air was so heavy it felt solid. A mix of rotting vegetation, river mud, and the sweet undertone of something I couldn't name. We beached the skiff on a narrow strip of dark sand and began unloading gear, tents, water drums, crates of equipment. The map had marked this place with a single faded symbol, a rough square with cross-hatching inside. Grayson thought it indicated an abandoned mission outpost. Maria thought it might be a burial site. As for me, I was just there to document the biodiversity. I'd told myself that was all I cared about. I knew better the moment I stepped off the boat. The jungle was silent. No birdsong, no insect hum, just the slow drip of water from leaves high above. Even the river behind us seemed to hush when I turned to look back. I tried not to dwell on it. We'd arrived late in the day and there was too much work to do before nightfall. We pitched the tents on a narrow rise above the waterline and set up the portable generator. The little patch of cleared ground felt like a raft in an endless green sea. As dusk fell, Leandro made a small fire and huddled beside it, eyes fixed on the trees. When Grayson offered him a share of our rations, he shook his head without looking away. "Does he think something's out there?" Maria asked quietly. Grayson snorted. "He thinks everything is haunted. Don't let it get to you." But I'd seen the way his hand shook when he traced the symbol on the map. By full dark, a thin mist had crept in from the river, beading on the tents and turning the air cold enough that we zipped our jackets to our throats. The generator hummed, its glow throwing long shadows across the clearing. I checked our supplies, ticking off each item on my clipboard. I told myself the routine would help settle the unease prickling under my skin. But every so often, I caught myself glancing at the tree line, and every time I was certain the shadows had shifted, just a fraction. After dinner, Grayson called us together. He unfolded the map on a plastic crate and traced a line with his finger. "Tomorrow, we'll follow this ridge. According to the archive, there should be stone foundations somewhere in this quadrant. If we find them, we can start the survey." Maria nodded, rubbing her arms. "And if we don't?" "Then we keep looking," he said simply. "We didn't come all this way to turn around because of a few old stories." Leandro muttered something in Portuguese, low and urgent. Grayson ignored him. I tried to focus on the logistics, battery life, sample bags, the probability of rain. But the silence pressed harder as the hours wore on, thickening until it felt like a weight on my chest. When I finally crawled into my tent, fatigue settled over me in a cold, heavy sheet. My last thought before sleep claimed me was that the jungle hadn't accepted our presence. It was only tolerating us, and tomorrow it might decide otherwise. I woke before dawn to the sound of rain. At first, I thought it was just the usual jungle downpour, thick sheets drumming the tent fly. But when I unzipped the flap and peered out, the clearing was dry. No rain, no mist, just darkness and the rhythmic tapping of something against the nylon. I lay back, listening. The noise came in slow, measured beats, too deliberate to be water, too patient to be an animal. When I finally fell asleep again, it was fitful, laced with dreams I couldn't fully remember. Shapes moving behind the trees, voices I almost recognized. Dawn came late, the light slow to penetrate the canopy. I sat up, blinking grit from my eyes, and waited to hear Grayson or Nerea stirring in the next tent. Nothing. I pushed the flap aside. The clearing was empty. At first I thought they'd gone to the river, maybe fetching water or checking the boat. But when I stood, the stillness struck me like a physical blow. The generator was off. The equipment crates were closed. Nothing had been disturbed, except the map. It lay unrolled beside the cold ashes of the fire, weighted down with a smooth, pale stone I hadn't seen before. The edges were damp with dew. I walked to the nearest tent and called Grayson's name. No answer. When I pulled the zipper open, I found his bedroll neatly folded. His pack was gone. The same with Maria's. Only Leandro's tent remained. The flap half collapsed. I crouched, pulling it open carefully. Empty. The breath caught in my throat. A slow, cold realization settled into my chest. They hadn't just left to scout ahead. They'd left deliberately, packed their things, walked into the jungle together, and not bothered to wake me. I looked back at the map. The stone weighed on it with quiet finality.
As though someone or something had placed it there to make sure I understood. We are finished waiting. I forced myself to move. I checked the perimeter of the clearing, calling their names until my voice was hoarse. No footprints marked the mud. No broken branches showed where they'd gone. It was as though they'd simply stepped out of the world. I tried to think rationally. Maybe they'd seen something, a signal, a landmark, and gone to investigate. Maybe they planned to return by noon. I knew even as I thought it, that it was a lie. By late morning, the sun had burned through the canopy in jagged spears of light. I sat on the edge of the crate where we'd spread the map the night before, holding the stone in my palm. It was smooth as porcelain. No tool marks, no sign of how it had been shaped. I set it aside and forced myself to take inventory. One tent, a week's supply of rations, the portable radio, which hissed with a constant, mindless static, 2 canteens of water, enough to survive, if I stayed disciplined, if I didn't let fear dictate my choices. I tried the radio again, cycling through every frequency. Nothing. When I finally looked up, the sun was high. No shadows moved at the tree line. But the certainty in my gut hadn't eased. They weren't coming back. I stood and turned slowly, scanning the dense green walls that hemmed in the clearing. My pulse thudded too fast. If I stayed here, I'd starve or go mad waiting. But if I followed, I risked the same fate that claimed them. I thought of Grayson's face the night before, lit by firelight as he traced the symbol on the map. The tightness around his mouth, the way he avoided looking at the trees. He'd known something. Maybe not consciously, but some part of him had expected this. I packed deliberately, moving with the slow care of someone afraid to wake a predator. When my kit was ready, I crouched beside the cold ashes of the fire. I left the smooth stone where it was, Then I stepped into the jungle alone. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. Cooler, denser, as though the trees had exhaled to welcome me. I didn't look back. First hour in the jungle felt like stepping into a closed room where no one had breathed in 100 years. The air was heavy, saturated with a wet green smell I couldn't separate from decay. My boots sank into the moss in slow inches. Every step was an effort, every breath measured against the tightness in my chest. I tried to move with purpose. I'd left the clearing following the faint suggestion of a trail, a line where the undergrowth thinned and a few low branches had been bent back. Maybe Grayson and the others had gone this way. Maybe something had guided them. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, watching for prints or broken leaves. But the jungle seemed to heal behind every step, closing around me in a hush so complete it felt alive.
By midday, the humidity had turned my clothes into a second skin. I stopped to sip water and force down a ration bar. The taste was sour, my mouth too dry to swallow easily. I tried the radio again. Static. I shut it off and clipped it back to my pack. I had to keep moving. Even if I didn't find them, I needed to find higher ground, somewhere to see past the trees to orient myself. The terrain sloped upward in a slow climb. Roots coiled across the path, slick with moss. I slipped twice, catching myself on low branches. Every time I paused to catch my breath, the silence pressed closer. No bird calls, no insect drone, no movement beyond the twitch of leaves in air I couldn't feel. By early afternoon, I stumbled into a small clearing. The ground was bare here, just dark earth littered with leaf fragments. In the center, a ring of stones enclosed a pit, blackened with old ash. It wasn't ours. I approached slowly, scanning the perimeter. No footprints, no discarded supplies. Just that cold ring, as if the fire had burned decades ago and never cooled. A memory rose unbidden. Leandro crouched by our own fire the first night, eyes fixed on the trees, the way he'd refused to speak when Grayson asked what he feared. I turned away from the fire ring. My pulse drummed too fast. Don't stop. Don't let it inside your head. I followed the slope upward until the trees thinned slightly. Pale trunks gave way to a lattice of vine and undergrowth that glowed faintly in the angled light. I pushed through it, ignoring the scratches that scored my forearms. Beyond the tangle, I found what I'd been searching for, a narrow rise that gave a partial view of the forest canopy. I dropped my pack and sat heavily, wiping sweat from my eyes. From here, the jungle stretched unbroken in every direction. No smoke, no movement, no hint of another human presence. The only landmark was a dark smear on the horizon, an irregular mound that rose above the trees. Too distant to make out detail, but it was something, a goal, a reason to keep moving. I closed my eyes, breathing slow. The urge to lie down and never get up pressed hard at the base of my skull, but I knew if I gave in, I wouldn't stand again. When I opened my eyes, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the soil by my boot, a shape had been traced with a fingertip or a stick. A simple symbol, two intersecting lines over a rough oval. Fresh, the edges still crisp. My mouth went dry. I hadn't seen it when I sat down. I looked around the clearing, heart hammering. No movement, no sound, but the knowledge settled in my chest like a stone. Someone had left it here. Or something. I forced myself to stand. My legs felt brittle, as though they might splinter under my weight. I packed up methodically, never taking my eyes from the undergrowth.
The rest of the day blurred into a long, slow descent. I moved without thinking, one foot before the other, driven by the need to put distance between myself and that symbol. By dusk, I'd found a shallow depression under a leaning tree. It wasn't shelter, but it felt less exposed. I unrolled my thin blanket and sat with my back against the trunk. I didn't light a fire. I didn't have the will to explain my presence to whatever watched from the dark. As the last light faded, I pulled the radio from my pack and held it in my lap. I turned the dial slowly, hoping for any break in the static. Nothing. The darkness settled in layers, deeper and heavier than I remembered. I closed my eyes, trying not to imagine shapes moving between the trunks. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would head for the mound. If Grayson had gone anywhere, it was toward that landmark, toward some answer he hadn't shared. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, a final thought crawled up from the hollow space in my chest. I wasn't following their trail. I was following the one laid for me. At first light, I forced myself to stand. My joints cracked in protest, every muscle leaden from a night of half-sleep and unbroken silence. I packed methodically, trying not to look at the shadows beyond the rise. They felt too still, too deliberate. I ate the last of a ration bar in dry, mechanical bites. The taste was chalky, sticking in my throat. When it was gone, I finished the last mouthful of water and clipped the empty canteen to my belt. Today, I would reach the mound. I had to believe that. If I didn't, the thought of moving at all would turn impossible. I set out along the narrow ridge, picking my way between roots as thick as my leg. Each time I looked up, the dark shape on the horizon seemed no closer. The sun climbed, burning off the dawn mist until the air grew heavy and metallic. Sweat soaked my clothes. My hands trembled when I paused to catch my breath. I tried the radio twice more. Still static. Still nothing but the faint click of empty channels. By midday, I came to a shallow depression in the forest floor. At first, I thought it was just an old washout. Earth slumped into itself after too many seasons of rain. But as I stepped closer, I saw the edges had been reinforced with cut saplings, arranged in a precise hexagonal pattern. In the center, half buried in leaf litter, lay a bundle wrapped in dark oilcloth. Crouched, heart thudding, my hands hovered over the bundle. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to know what it contained. But if I left it untouched, it would follow me in thought, growing larger each mile I walked away. I swallowed and reached out. The cloth peeled back with a damp sigh. Inside, neatly folded, was Grayson's field jacket, the same one he'd worn the night before he vanished, the same one he'd refused to remove even in the stifling heat. I lifted it slowly. Beneath it, the dirt was marked by a single symbol, an oval encircled by a broken line, the same shape I'd seen drawn in the soil by my boot. My breath caught. I pressed the back of my wrist to my mouth, fighting the nausea that crawled up my throat. I left the bundle where it was. I couldn't bring myself to carry it, but I couldn't pretend it wasn't meant for me to find. I turned away, eyes fixed on the mound ahead. Hours passed. The forest blurred around me, an endless wall of green. My vision tunneled. My steps became a slow, automatic trudge. Once I thought I heard movement behind me, soft footfalls that matched my pace exactly. When I turned, the trees stood silent, unmoving. I kept going.
By late afternoon, I reached the base of the rise. Up close, it was larger than I'd realized, an earthen mound crusted with moss and vines, nearly twice my height. It looked too regular to be natural, the slope rising in a precise curve before flattening at the crown. I circled it slowly, searching for any sign the others had been here. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded gear. Only a narrow notch in the slope, half obscured by hanging roots. A dark opening, no wider than my shoulders. I stared at it, heart hammering. If they'd come this way, it was here they'd gone. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. And I knew that if I stepped inside, the forest would swallow me as it had swallowed them. I turned away, pressing my palm to the cool earth. I couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, I sat at the base of the mound, back against the roots, and closed my eyes. My breath came shallow and ragged. For the first time since I woke alone, I allowed myself to admit that I might not leave this place. When I opened my eyes again, the shadows had lengthened. The mound's crown was a silhouette against the last red spill of sunset. And in that fading light, I saw them. Symbols, dozens of them, etched into the earth around the base. Some I recognized, variations on the broken circle. Others were new, spirals, crosses, hash marks that seemed to crawl when I tried to trace them with my gaze. They ringed the mound like a quiet declaration. You have arrived. I didn't light a fire that night. The darkness fell with a finality I didn't try to challenge. I lay with my back to the mound, staring into the tree line. And though I saw no movement, I knew I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I didn't sleep. Every time my eyelids drifted shut, a sound snapped them open again. The slow rustle of leaves without wind, the delicate click of something moving across stone. My heart never settled. It beat a steady, frantic rhythm until my ribs ached. I watched the darkness bleed into dawn, and by the time the first pale light filtered through the trees, I knew I couldn't spend another day outside the mound. I had no illusions left. If Grayson and the others had come here, they hadn't emerged. But it no longer mattered. Staying put would only mean starving in the shadow of this place, listening to whatever waited in the dark. At least inside, I might find answers. I rose stiffly, every joint shrieking protest. My hands shook as I gathered my pack, though there was little left inside it. The empty water canteen, the radio still muttering static. A single ration bar I hadn't touched the day before. I walked once around the base of the mound, studying the symbols etched into the earth. In daylight, they looked older, their edges softened by years of rain. But as I passed them, I felt a low vibration underfoot. So subtle, I thought at first it was my pulse echoing in my ears. At the narrow entrance, I paused. A smell drifted out. Damp earth mixed with that sweet, rotting perfume I'd first noticed on the riverbank. It was stronger here, thick enough to make my eyes water. I swallowed against the nausea and crouched low, slipping into the darkness. Inside, the temperature dropped at once. My breath came in shallow clouds. I held up my flashlight and swept the narrow beam over the walls. Stone. Smooth, pale, fitted without mortar. The passage sloped down in a slow curve. Each step brought the ceiling lower until I had to duck. About 10 yards in, the chamber opened into a chamber. I stood at the threshold, fighting the urge to retreat. The walls here were covered in carvings, hundreds of them. Spirals, circles, and symbols I didn't recognize. Some were small as a handprint, others taller than I was.
The flashlight's beam made them flicker, as if alive. In the center of the floor lay a shallow depression filled with dark water. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the light in an unbroken sheet. I stepped closer, every sense straining. Something about the pool felt wrong, not dangerous, just patient, like it had been waiting for me longer than I'd been alive. I sank to my knees at the edge, the cold seeping through my pants. My reflection stared back, hollow eyes, skin gray with exhaustion. For a long moment, I did nothing, just breathed, aware of every inch of empty tunnel behind me. Then, as if guided by hands I couldn't see, I set down the radio beside the water. My fingers moved without conscious thought. The radio hissed, unchanged, but the pool seemed to vibrate in answer. I pulled the last ration bar out of my pocket and unwrapped it slowly. I broke it in half and laid the pieces on the stone beside the radio. A ritual. That's what it felt like, though no part of me believed in rituals. When I looked up, my own reflection had blurred. The surface of the water rippled without sound. My heart hammered. I whispered, though I didn't know to whom. "What do you want from me?" Nothing answered, but the ripples widened until they touched the carved edges of the basin. The humming started then, a low resonance I felt in my teeth. It built in slow waves, filling my skull until I pressed my palms over my ears. It didn't help. The sound wasn't outside me, it was inside. I don't know how long I knelt there. Time had no shape. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. My body was cold all over. Then, as abruptly as it began, the humming stopped. The water stilled. My reflection returned. I waited, but no further change came. I stood on unsteady legs. My vision swam. I gathered the radio, though it felt absurd to do so. My hand lingered over the ration bar. I left it behind. When I stepped into the tunnel again, the hush pressed close. The air seemed warmer, almost forgiving. Outside, dawn had brightened to full daylight. I emerged blinking, breath fogging the air behind me. The forest looked unchanged, but as I stood there, I felt a quiet certainty in my chest. Something had been given, something had been received. And for the first time since the others vanished, I believed I might leave this place. I stood at the mouth of the mound, blinking in the early light. The air smelled cleaner than it had in days, sharp with green and river mud instead of that cloying sweetness. I took a deep breath and felt something in my chest loosen, as if a knot had slipped free. The relief was fragile, tentative, but it was enough to make my hand stop shaking. I turned in a slow circle, studying the trees. They looked no different, pale trunks rising into a canopy that hid the sun, but the oppressive weight I'd felt pressing against my ribs since the first night was gone. Or if it wasn't gone, it had retreated, watching maybe, but no longer reaching for me. I slung my nearly empty pack over my shoulder. My muscles felt rubbery, as if they might give out if I moved too quickly. But I didn't dare wait. Every hour spent here risked the same dissolution that had claimed the others. I picked a direction, toward the river, if my sense of distance was still worth anything, and began to walk. The climb down from the mound was slower than I liked. Twice I slipped and slid a few feet before catching myself. Each time, I half expected the humming to start again. Each time, the silence held. By mid-morning, the ground leveled. I found a line of old cut branches laid side by side, some forgotten path, maybe, or a marker of something I hadn't understood. I followed it because it was the only trace of order in the endless green. Hours blurred. My body moved on instinct, one foot after another. I forced myself to count the steps between rest stops. 50. Then a pause to breathe. 50 more. Anything to keep from thinking too much. By early afternoon, the light shifted, warmer, less filtered. When I looked up, the canopy thinned.
My heart lurched. I pushed through a curtain of vines and stumbled onto an open bank of packed earth. Below, the river gleamed, wide and brown and familiar in a way that made my knees buckle. The skiff we'd arrived in was still there, its hull tilted half onto the mud. The outboard motor hung at an odd angle, but it was there. I laughed, a sharp, ragged sound that startled a flock of small birds into flight. For a moment, I stood with my hand over my mouth, fighting the tears that wanted to come. I scrambled down the slope, half sliding in my haste. The skiff's stern was cracked. A long split ran up the side of the hull, but it floated when I rocked it gently. Barely, but it floated. Checked the fuel tank. Less than half full. It would have to be enough. I didn't think as I moved. My hands found the radio, secured it under the seat. I unlooped the mooring line and shoved the skiff into deeper water. When I climbed aboard, the hull dipped alarmingly. I braced my weight and squeezed the primer bulb on the fuel line until my fingers ached. The first pull of the starter cord gave nothing. The second, a sputter. On the third, the engine coughed to life, uneven and wet but running. I didn't look back at the trees. I eased the throttle open. The skiff mosed downstream, picking up speed. The current felt like a living thing, pulling me away from the mound and the clearing, the symbols I would never understand. I kept one hand on the tiller and one on the radio. Every few minutes I tried another frequency. Static. More static. Then, after an hour of drifting past vine-choked banks, a voice broke through. "Anyone receiving? Please respond." I mashed the transmit button, my voice a croak. This is Field Team 4. I'm alive. Request immediate assistance." The voice crackled again, clearer this time. "Field Team 4, copy. We have your coordinates. Hold position." I slumped over the tiller, breath shaking out of me in a long, shuddering exhale. The riverbank slipped past, mile after mile of indifferent green. But the sky was wide and blue overhead, ordinary, safe. I didn't see the mound again. When the rescue boat arrived near dusk, I didn't recognize the crew. They pulled me aboard without questions, wrapping me in a blanket that smelled of diesel and soap. Someone pressed the bottle of water into my hand. I drank until I choked. Only when the engines turned and the skiff shrank behind us did I finally look back. The jungle stood in perfect stillness, the shadows deepening as night fell. No movement, no sign that it had ever known me. And for that, I was grateful. I closed my eyes. The memory of the carvings and the humming would stay. I knew that. Some part of me suspected I would never sleep without remembering them. But I was alive, and in the end, that was the only answer I had ever needed.